A year from now, the counting of votes will be underway in the Scottish Parliament election. Between now and then, we can expect a long and hard-fought campaign. Today, party leaders set out some of their key messages.
We must build a winning coalition that is as broad as it is high. A year today, I don't just want to win. I want us to shift the tectonic plates of Scottish politics and create a wave of hope that will overcome Westminster's wall of despair in our country today.
We are putting forward our own positive vision, a proud Scottish Conservative vision for a better and more prosperous Scotland. In just 1 year from now, we can remove the SNP from power. So let's move on from this wasted era of division and failure.
So the choice is a third decade of the SNP in power or a new direction. And this coming election will be the most consequential and important in the history of devolution. And this Scottish Labour Party is ready to fight it and win it for the people of Scotland.
So, with 1 year to go, how are Scotland's parties faring and what are opinion polls telling us about what the public thinks? Alan Folds, who runs the Ballot Box Scotland Elections website, joined us in the studio. So let's start with the Scottish election results in 2021, and we can see here SNP clearly out in front with 64 seats. Tories had a strong second place with 31 seats. Labour were in third and the Greens in fourth. So it was a clear victory for the SNP.
Yeah, very much a clear victory, but also kind of a no-change parliament. Only a couple of seats changed from the previous election, and it did feel very much like a foregone conclusion given Nicola Sturgeon's popularity during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, so that was then, this is now, and opinion polls are suggesting a very different kind of result, but SNP still in front.
SNP still very far in front, and what's really interesting is that they're projected at the moment not to lose that many seats, but that isn't because they've had a big recovery in their support. They've only gained a handful of percentage points. They've lost about a quarter of their support. It's because Labour have collapsed so hard that the SNP are out so far in front that even though it's a proportional system, it's not fully proportional, and they're able to win quite a lot of sort of unearned, undeserved, proportionally speaking, constituency seats, and that gives them a big lead.
Well, as you say, Labour look like they're in a bit of trouble, and the Conservatives too. They're both going to fall back.
Yeah, I mean, Labour may limit their losses quite to only a couple of seats, but when you were thinking about the fact that after the general election last year, Anna Sarwar thought he was on path to Butte House, I think we all thought that. Those dreams have very much gone up in flames. The Conservatives, though, probably will have the worst result overall. They were insulated from that last year by first past the post. They only lost one seat, even though they lost half of their support. But in Scotland, with a proportional system, they're on track to lose at least half of their seats. And the big thing for them there is that they might actually lose both of their Glasgow seats, which would mean that for the first time in history, they don't have a seat in every single region. And also, most recently, they've been slipping behind Reform and could place fourth.
Well, let's talk about Reform. This opinion poll today from Survation, and we have to point out this is just one opinion poll, but it's putting them in second place in the Scottish election. They could come out with 21 seats. I mean, that's incredible.
I nearly enough fell off my chair when I saw that. Especially given that Survation a couple of weeks ago found them on 12%, which is a really good result, but to go up 8% in that period, it is absolutely astonishing. As you say, it's one poll, so don't read too much into it, but the trend there is very much that Reform they're here to stay, and they will win big next year in some form or another.
And at whose expense are they going to win in Scotland then?
So it's going to be largely at the Conservatives' expense. As I was saying, Conservatives losing half of their seats. Most of those are going to Reform. That is where because the SNP have such a big constituency lead, it's list seats that are changing, and because the Conservatives are losing them, those are all totting up in Reform's column. And
they are doing well, right across the country. Do you think this is a trend that can continue until next year, the Scottish elections? So
it's hard to say. At the moment, when we're in this kind of in-between elections period, you think obviously we had local elections in England last week, that is a time where people will say they'll do protest votes, so they'll think about doing a protest vote. Whether that continues all the way up to the election, when we're actually looking at a potential change of Scottish government for the first time in what will be 19 years at that point, I'm not sure it will necessarily hold up all the way there. But of course, stranger things have happened. We didn't expect them to be where they are just now. So I might say they'd suggest they drop back a little bit, but I wouldn't wouldn't put any money on it.
What about the Lib Dems and the Greens? What are the polls saying about how they're going to fare?
So kind of both on track for pretty good results. I would say that starting with the Greens just because they're the larger party at present. The boundary changes that are coming through, very favourable to the Greens. That gives them an extra 2 seats in 2021 terms compared to what they actually won. They have a bit of a problem though, which is because their vote is so evenly distributed, even if they get an extra 1 or 2% of the vote, they don't really get beyond 10. It's once they get maybe 3 or 4%, suddenly they rapidly gain more seats. So they're kind of plateauing. The Lib Dems probably end up very happy with whatever they get. They're polling a little bit above where they were previously. They will almost certainly win the Caithness-Sutherland and Ross seat. They are ecstatic about the new Edinburgh Northern seat, which has been drawn very favourably to them. Probably regain some list seats in the North East, South and West. And like the Conservatives, they probably won't win a seat in every region in Scotland. But if the Lib Dems end up with 8 or 9 seats in the Scottish Parliament, they would be beside themselves because that is a doubling compared to what they've had.
Yeah, and so we may end up with a pro-independence Parliament. What would that mean? What would be the consequences?
Well, it's really interesting because we may end up with one, but the votes wouldn't justify it. The past few elections, the votes have justified that that is what should have been there based on how the system works. This time around, it'd be a pro-independence majority without anywhere near a pro-independence lead in votes. So it's hard to see how, for example, John Swinney could sell that as a mandate for another independence referendum. For example, how do you take what is a loss of 10, 15% of support for your party, then go, but we should get another referendum. Also, even if the SNP come up and Greens come up maybe a little bit short, if the SNP still have a lead of about, say, 30 seats over Labour, there's no way Labour can lead a government with that level of gap. And the question is, do the Lib Dems then start working with the SNP and Greens?
It's going to be a very different dynamic at Holyrood, isn't it? If there are 6 different parties, just with Reform thrown into the mix, with this possible potential 21 seats, it's going to be very different.
It's going to be very different and very chaotic. I think the thing I've said before is that when they won 7 seats in the Welsh, the Senedd Cymru in 2016, they ended up finishing the term with 1 of those seats. These have always been really fractious parliamentary groups. So how do you work with them? And as I said, is that a circumstance where the Lib Dems go, well, we'd rather work with the SNP and Greens, much as they might not like it, rather than go with a chaotic Reform alignment?
We'll have to wait and see. Alan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as we've been discussing, Reform UK seem to have pretty much all the momentum in politics at the moment. With us now, the party's Glasgow councillor Thomas Kerr, who defected from the Scottish Conservatives earlier this year. Thomas, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Were you buoyed up by today's Scottish poll, which puts Reform in 2nd place?
Absolutely. Look, we had some fantastic results in England last week, and I thought that momentum would have pushed us into having a poll that would show us something like this. I'm not surprised because it's the feeling that we're getting on the ground. And I've sat in studios like this for 4 months speaking to people, and what I've said is the sky's the limit for Reform, and we've been sniggered and laughed at by our opponents. Well, they're not laughing now, Rona, because what we're showing is that actually we could be the 2nd biggest party in Scotland. We are now the alternative to the SNP. That is a huge stride for a party that didn't exist only a couple of years ago. OK,
but we just have to emphasise it is just one poll, but what are you putting this surge in support down to? I think people are fed up and angry. I think that if you go about the streets and you speak to voters out there, they are scunnered and angry with the political establishment in Holyrood. They believe that there's 5 parties there who it's not really much difference between all of them, and they're looking for something really different. So they're looking at their paychecks at the end of the month and thinking, hang on a minute, my bills don't add up. They're looking at housing and their kids can't get a house. They're looking at their parents not being able to get NHS appointments, and they're just feeling as if the system isn't built up to support them, and I think Reform is there to try and offer that change. OK, but what are you offering? Because it seems to me that your policies aren't very clear. When people say they're supporting you, what are they actually in favour of? Well, I've been very clear about that. We are a new political party, and come the Holyrood election next year, when people will finally put their cross in the ballot, Reform will have a fully pledged manifesto, but we have key principles that we stand up for. So we want to cut tax, we want to support business, we want to end wokery, we want to scrap net zero. We're a pro-UK party, we are against independence. So there are key principles that we stand for, but when it comes to individual policies, that will all come as we head in towards the Holyrood election. But I mean, for instance, what are your policies going to be on the NHS? Well, we've been very clear. So the NHS, firstly, let me put to bed a myth or a lie, actually, that's been portrayed by our opponents that Reform would privatise the NHS. We will not. The NHS will always be free at the point of use. But what we've said is we have to make sure the system is worked. So that's cutting out the waste that exists in the NHS. It's not about just tossing money, but trying to make sure that it's much more effective. That's what the Tories are saying as well. Well, but the Tories have said that for the past 15 years, 14 years when they were in government down south, that the problem is all of the political parties in Holyrood have said stuff and they've not delivered. Reform will have a clear manifesto when it comes to the NHS and how we try and transform
transform it. It's about reforming the system. As every politician likes saying, we need reform. Well, I absolutely agree, but we need reform as a party to then get the reform of the public services that we need.
You say you're anti-independence, but some of your parties did support independence in the referendum.
No, in the past people voted yes, in the same way that Dr Lisa Cameron, who joined the Conservative Party, voted for independence. But all members of the Reform UK Party, so David Kirkwood, for example, who was the famous one the Tories like to parade everywhere, is now a pro-UK person. He has now said he would vote against a referendum, but in 2014 he did vote yes. Yeah. The same as many people did, but my job is to persuade people to come with us. We'll only keep the union clear and keep the union together if we can convince people over, but Reform is an unashamedly pro-UK party and we make no exceptions about that.
How much of a problem do you think it is that so much of your appeal is down to one man, Nigel Farage?
I don't know if that is the case. I think that Nigel is obviously a big personality.
Do you think you'd be equally popular if it wasn't for Nigel Farage?
I think that right now our message is cutting through. Whether Nigel's there or Nigel isn't there, I think the Reform's message is very, very clear. But Nigel is a very popular politician, and when you have a popular politician, you utilise them as much as possible. It's what the SNP's done for years with Nicola Sturgeon. And I think that Nigel Farage has an appeal right across the track with people, young people, people middle-aged, people who are older, because he has said the same things for the past 15 years and cuts through.
So you see him as a big asset, obviously. Will he be heading up the Scottish election campaign then?
Yes, so he'll be here very soon. I spoke to Nigel last Thursday when I was down in Runcorn. I had a good chat with him. He's looking forward to coming up to Scotland. He's looking forward to being part of that campaign, and he will have a public role in that.
And do you think you can keep up this momentum until next year? I
am very confident that we'll be able to keep up the momentum we've got. I think if you go across working class communities across the Central Belt, people are scunnered and fed up, and we are the opposition and we're showing people our policies, and I think that will only continue to grow.
Okay, I'll let you draw breath, Thomas. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.